when the Germans marched in the first week, they had a pogrom. And because our home was was a new building, was such a beautiful home, that it attracted attention. Even though our name was not on the list for the pogrom, we were, you know, the German soldier, we were looking through the window and we saw that he said, well, what about here? And so they said, the Ukrainians, okay, let's go. There was a whole bunch of them with a few soldiers, German soldiers. So there was a big pogrom a week after they entered our town. And my mother and I were beaten up terribly. They threw my mother out into the courtyard and they beat her with guns. She had, I remember my sister and I were standing on the doorway and we were screaming and her blood was gushing out of her head, and I remember that sound. It went like zzzz, that kind of a sound. And after a while she stopped screaming and they said, well, you know, she's done. So my sister pulled me away from the doorway. And the next thing I know, I was lying under a bed in a bedroom. And apparently they were looking for me. And I must have been unconscious, I don't know. But I opened up my eyes and I tried to get up and I tried to say, here I am, and I realized that nothing was coming out of my mouth and I couldn't move. There was something lying under the bed and I tried to reach it so I could get up, and I couldn't do that. And I probably was unconscious again, off and on, and because I remember waking up a few times and they were looking for me. My mother's brother, Friedel, came to help. And the next thing I knew, I was lying on a couch in the living room. And I was covered with a sheet over I think I had like a sitter under my head, and my father was crying, and they said, and my uncle and my father thought I was dead. And at that time, I was 7 years old, and I thought they were going to bury me alive. I was like so frightened. I kept thinking, oh my God, I'm alive here. I'm alive, you know, don't leave me. And they kept looking at me and covering me up. And they were busy with my mother because she had 7 holes in her head, and they crushed her, all her bones in her head, and she had a broken bone right over her eye and her nose, and they were trying to, you know, treat her and try to wash all the blood away from her. She was gushing with blood. And they left me alone, and I thought, you know, that was the end of me. Luckily, my sister, for some reason or other, wasn't even touched, but my mother had a friend visiting. It was on a Friday night, and her baby was killed in the house, 9-month-old baby. And that was the beginning of, you know, so of course the next morning, my father gathered up my mother and I and my sister, and he moved us into a poor section of the town. And we were not allowed to get any medical attention. And then we found out later on that many people were killed and injured, but my mother and I were one of the most severely injured. And I must have had a blow to my head so severe that it probably caused like a stroke on my right side, because I was paralyzed for almost a year. And my head was like a ball, very soft. And my whole face was swollen. And I closed, my eyes were all swollen. And I remember lying in bed with my mother, and she was all bandaged up, and she was praying, please God, let her die. She's deaf and mute and paralyzed. But my mind was working. I knew what was going on, but I couldn't communicate for a long time. And at that time is when we met one of my father's clients that he used to deal with. You know, he was a farmer that lived 3 kilometers from our town in Shipkov. And he came, he must have heard what happened. So he came and he looked at my mother and I, and he was like crying. He couldn't believe that this happened. And I heard him say, well, what did this child do to deserve this? And he started coming around, bringing eggs and butter once in a while. And this is how our friendship started with him.
What was his name?
His name was Pavlo Gerasimchuk. He had on a huge coat with pockets, and he would put the food in his pocket. And he couldn't give us much because he was very poor. A piece of bread, maybe a little bit of soup, a bottle of water. And he would try once a day, or maybe every other day, come into the barn like he would be getting hay out for the horses. You know, he had always, not just to come in, he always came out doing something that wouldn't be suspicious for anybody. And he would give us that stuff. And once a night, he gave us a pot for elimination. And that was the most dangerous part of the whole 18 months of hiding, because once a night, the same thing, he would call the dog Briscoe, and the dog would be running around all over, make sure there's no one around, and he would go from the outside of the barn, Pablo, and take out a piece of the sled, and my father would crawl out with the pot, and not far from there was a little river, and he would throw it into the river. But it was a very dangerous thing to do, because you never knew, you know, if anybody, even though the dog, you know, it's still a dog. And so when he could, of course, when he couldn't, it would go on for more than a day, or at night. It was usually at night that would happen. The piece of bread that we had to share with mice. The mice were always around. They were our best buddies. They wanted the bread. You had to hold it like this, otherwise they would grab it out of your hand. And I was very fearful always of mice, but you get used to it. Lice, like unbelievable. We were covered with lice. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had no light at all. The only light we had was between the slats of the wood. And in order for my father and mother and myself to keep sane, my father would teach me the Bible by heart. I knew the whole Bible by heart. Every day, you know, he would teach me something else. And when he would forget a word, I would remind him. So I became like very religious, always reciting something from the Bible. And also, Pablo, my mother asked for wool, and she started knitting. I don't know how she was knitting with all the mice and the lice, but I don't know, she was knitting. I remember her knitting all kinds of sweaters for the girls. And my father, he bought wood, and my father would carve shoes from wood, just to do something. And then the children would go to church, and everybody wanted to know, who made you these beautiful shoes, and who made you, you know, you had to create all kinds of stories for that. But they were busy up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then it was pitch black. And this is how we survive. It's like if someone would come and tell me, I would never believe that anyone could live like this for 18 months. But we did. We lived for 18 months with very little food, no water except just a drink to wet our lips, you know, and the pot, and the mice.